She was only 6 when she first married. At 12, she was forced to wed a man twice her age and widowed within a year. By 13, she gave birth to a child who nearly killed her. This isn't the Game of Thrones plot. It's the real life of Margaret Beaufort, a girl used as a pawn by powerful men who defied them all to rewrite England's future. Margaret wasn't born powerful. She was sold like property. They tore her only child away for 14 long years. She faced execution for treason, but she never broke. She plotted, she waited, and in the end, she won. Yet victory came with a price. Her final days were filled with pain and regret. She spent her life fighting for her son, and when death took him, it took her will to live too. 2 months later, her broken heart gave out. The woman who built the Tudor dynasty died just weeks after her son, alone, heartbroken, and worn out by the battles she fought for everyone but herself. This is a story of pain, courage, and ruthless ambition, where kings fell, children died, and a mother's love changed a nation. If you love incredible true stories from history, hit that like button right now. It really helps this channel grow. And share this video with your fellow history lovers who need to hear Margaret's story.
Margaret Beaufort was born on May 31st, 1443. Her father was John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Her mother was Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. She was their only surviving child. That detail matters more than you think. Margaret's family tree was complicated. Her bloodline traced back to King Edward III, who had ruled England decades earlier. But there was a problem with this royal connection. A scandal, actually. Her grandfather, John Beaufort, was born out of wedlock. His father was John of Gaunt, a powerful duke, and his mother was Catherine Swynford, Gaunt's longtime mistress. His parents weren't married when he was born. For years, John Beaufort and his siblings had no legal status. They were bastards in the eyes of the church and the law. But money and power change everything. After John of Gaunt's wife died, he married Catherine. Then he did something extraordinary. He convinced the Pope to declare their children legitimate, not just from that point forward, retroactively, as if they'd never been born outside marriage at all. Parliament agreed. The children were now legal. But there was a catch. In 1407, a new clause was added. The Beaufort family could never inherit the throne, ever. They had royal blood, but they were barred from wearing the crown. This was Margaret's inheritance, royal blood with a permanent stain. When she was barely 1 year old, her father died. Some historians believe he took his own life. He'd failed in battle, lost money, lost respect. Death, perhaps, seemed easier than shame. Margaret was now alone, an orphan, but she wasn't worthless. She was an heiress. She owned lands, estates, money. In medieval England, that made her valuable. Within days of her father's death, powerful men started fighting over her. Not because they cared about her, because they wanted control of her wealth. Her guardianship was given to William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk. He was a favorite of the king, and he had plans for little Margaret. In early 1450, when Margaret was just 6 years old, Suffolk married her to his own son. The boy's name was John de la Pole. He was 7. Let that sink in. A 6-year-old bride, a 7-year-old groom. This wasn't a real marriage, not in any meaningful sense. The children lived apart. Margaret stayed with her mother. The marriage was never consummated. 3 years later, it was annulled, dissolved, as if it never happened. Margaret herself didn't consider John de la Pole her husband, but legally it was complicated. Some people argued it counted. Others said it didn't. Either way, Margaret had learned something important at a very young age. She was a pawn, a piece to be moved around by more powerful people. That lesson would shape everything that came after. In 1450, Suffolk was murdered. Nobles across England hated him. When he died, Margaret's guardianship was up for grabs again. In 1453, control of her life passed to 2 new men, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. They were half-brothers of King Henry VI. Their story was almost as scandalous as Margaret's own bloodline. Their mother was Catherine of Valois, a French princess and former Queen of England. After her husband died, she secretly married a Welsh commoner named Owen Tudor. It was forbidden, but it happened. Edmund and Jasper were the children of this hidden marriage. Royal on their mother's side, common on their father's. Now these two men controlled Margaret's future, and they had plans.
In 1455, right after Margaret turned 12, she was married again, this time to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was in his mid-20s. This marriage was different. It was consummated. Edmund wanted an heir. He wanted it immediately. He didn't care that his wife was barely a teenager. He didn't care that her body wasn't ready. All that mattered was producing a son. Margaret and Edmund traveled to Wales. They set up home in Lampthe, Pembrokeshire. It was remote, isolated. Around the end of April 1456, Margaret conceived. She was 12 years old, still about a month away from turning 13. She was a child, carrying a child. But Edmund would never see his son or daughter. War was coming to England. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between two branches of the royal family, was tearing the country apart. Edmund was captured by enemy forces in August 1456. He was thrown into Carmarthen Castle, and there he caught the plague. On November 1st, 1456, Edmund Tudor died. Margaret was 12 years old, pregnant, and now a widow. She moved to Pembroke Castle. Her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, took her in. He tried to protect her, but nothing could protect her from what was coming. On January 28, 1457, Margaret went into labor. She was 13 years old. Her body was small, underdeveloped, not ready for childbirth. The labor was agonizing. It went on for hours, maybe days. Medieval medicine couldn't do much. There were no painkillers, no anesthesia, no real understanding of what could go wrong. Margaret screamed. She bled. She thought she might die. Historians like Elizabeth Norton, Linda Porter, and Leanda de Lisle say the birth was so dangerous she was lucky to survive. But at last, the baby came. A boy. She named him Henry. Henry Tudor. He was tiny, fragile, but alive. Margaret survived too, barely. The birth had damaged her body, probably permanently. She would marry twice more in her life, but she never had another child, ever. At 13, her body had been destroyed by a pregnancy she never should have carried. But she had her son, and that was everything. Except she wouldn't keep him for long. Less than a year after Henry's birth, Margaret married again, this time by choice. Her new husband, Henry Stafford, was the son of the Duke of Buckingham and over 30 years old. But unlike before, she wasn't a helpless child anymore. She was learning to stand her ground, and she had only one thing on her mind: her son's future. For once, she hoped for peace, a quiet life with her husband and son. But this time, she faced another problem: the war that was about to consume England. The Wars of the Roses were getting worse. Two families were fighting for the throne, the Lancasters and the Yorks. Margaret's family was Lancastrian. They wore the red rose as their symbol. King Henry VI, Margaret's cousin and brother-in-law, was weak. He had serious mental health problems. For almost a year, he'd been completely catatonic, unable to speak, unable to move. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, tried to hold power, but the Yorkists smelled weakness. Battle after battle was fought. The throne changed hands. Kings were crowned and uncrowned. Men died by the thousands. Margaret watched it all, powerless. In 1461, everything collapsed. The Lancastrians lost. Edward IV, a young Yorkist lord, took the throne. King Henry VI and his family fled to Scotland. Margaret's world fell apart. Her husband fought for the Lancastrians at the Battle of Taunton. They lost badly. Margaret and her husband could have been executed. Their lands could have been seized. But Edward IV did something unexpected. He showed mercy. He pardoned them, let them keep their estates. Yet what he gave with one hand, he stole with the other. He took something Margaret could never replace, her one and only child, her son, Henry Tudor. 4-year-old Henry Tudor was stripped of his title, his inheritance, and his mother. He was handed to William, Lord Herbert, a loyal Yorkist, to be raised as one of their own. Margaret could write letters, she could visit sometimes, but she had no power, no say, no control. Her only child, the child she had nearly died to bring into this world, was now being raised by her enemies. And for a woman who could never bear another child, that loss was a living death. But Margaret didn't give up. She couldn't. Henry was all she had. For years she watched, waited, schemed quietly. In 1469, there was a battle. Lord Herbert was ordered to fight alongside the king. He brought 12-year-old Henry Tudor with him. The Yorkists lost. Herbert was executed. When Margaret heard the news, she panicked. Was her son dead? Injured? She had no way to know. Finally, word came. Henry was alive. He'd been taken to Herbert's widow, Anne Devereux. Margaret tried to negotiate. She reached out to powerful lords, trying to get Henry's lands back and improve his position. But every move was dangerous. King Edward IV still suspected young Henry Tudor because of his Lancastrian bloodline. One wrong step could get both Margaret and Henry accused of treason.
In 1470, the Wars of the Roses took another shocking turn. The Lancastrians rose again. King Henry VI was restored to the throne, and Edward IV fled into exile. For the first time in years, Margaret felt hope. Her brother-in-law was king once more, and she was back in favor. Even better, her son was returned to her. After years apart, mother and child were finally reunited in London. Imagine that moment. The boy she'd last held as a baby now stood before her as a teenager. They dined with the king. According to later sources, Henry VI looked at young Henry Tudor and said something strange. "This boy will be king one day." It seemed impossible. Henry Tudor was just a teenager. He had almost no claim to the throne. His family's bloodline was tainted by illegitimacy and legally barred from the crown. But the words would prove prophetic. A king had just named his successor, and destiny had begun to move. Sadly, the reunion didn't last long. In March 1471, Edward IV returned with an army. He crushed the Lancastrians. Again, King Henry VI was thrown back into the Tower of London. The Lancastrian Prince of Wales, the king's only son, was killed in battle. He was 17 years old. On May 21, 1471, King Henry VI died in the Tower, mysteriously, almost certainly murdered. The Lancastrian cause was dead, and 14-year-old Henry Tudor was now in terrible danger. He was the last surviving Lancastrian male with any claim to the throne. That made him a target. Margaret knew what was coming. She could read the shifting winds of power better than most men at court. She sent a secret message to her son. Don't trust Edward IV. Don't accept any pardons. Run. Henry and his uncle Jasper fled England. They sailed for France but were blown off course. They ended up in Brittany, a semi-independent region. Henry was safe, for now, but Margaret wouldn't see him again for 14 long years. That same year, tragedy struck again. Her husband, Henry Stafford, died from wounds he'd carried since the battle. Margaret was widowed once more, alone, but no longer helpless. She was learning, adapting. Within months, she remarried. Her third husband was Thomas, Lord Stanley, a powerful noble and favorite of King Edward IV, a Yorkist. But this time, she didn't marry for love or survival. She married for strategy, for her son. Stanley's loyalty to Edward IV protected her. It gave Margaret access to the royal court and the power she needed to play her next move. For Stanley, the marriage brought wealth. Margaret controlled significant lands. Margaret threw herself into court life. She attended royal events, christenings,
burials, ceremonies. She played the part of a loyal Yorkist noblewoman, but she never stopped working for her son. She made a will that set aside lands for Henry, if he ever returned. She sent him warnings through secret channels. Don't trust the king. Don't come back yet. Edward IV hunted Henry across Europe, nearly caught him several times. If he'd succeeded, Henry would likely have been executed, but Margaret stayed close to the royal court, carefully watching every move. Every chance she got, she sent warnings, guided her son, and protected him in secret. She never committed openly to anyone, never made a step that could endanger him. Her patience and cunning kept Henry alive when the kingdom itself wanted him dead.
In April 1483, everything changed. King Edward IV died suddenly. He was only 40 years old. His 12-year-old son became King Edward V. What happened next would shock England. The boy king's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was supposed to protect him. Instead, he seized control. Richard intercepted Edward V on his way to London. He arrested the boy's protectors, had them killed. He took custody of Edward V. He put him in the Tower of London, supposedly for safety. Then he demanded custody of Edward's younger brother too, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. The boy's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, was hiding in sanctuary with her daughters. She was terrified, but eventually she gave up her younger son. Both princes were now in the Tower. Then Richard made his move. He announced that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid. His children were illegitimate. They had no right to the throne. Richard declared himself the rightful king. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned Richard III. The two princes in the Tower were never seen again. What happened to them? No one knows for certain, but most historians believe Richard III had them murdered. Yet there's another theory, one that's gained attention in recent years. Some people claim Margaret Beaufort killed them, that she had the princes murdered to clear a path to the throne for her son. This theory is wrong, completely wrong. Here's why. First, there's no evidence. None. Not a single document, not one witness. Nothing connects Margaret to their disappearance. Second, how would she have done it? The princes were locked in the Tower of London, one of the most secure fortresses in England. How would Margaret's agents get in, murder two high-profile prisoners, get out without being caught? Third, she had no motive. Not in 1483. Her son's chances of becoming king were astronomically low. Richard III was on the throne. He had a legitimate son. Other claimants had better claims than Henry Tudor. Killing the princes would have only strengthened Richard's position. It would have removed the last challenge to his rule. If Margaret had done it, Richard would have blamed her publicly. He would have used it as an excuse to execute her. He never did, because he couldn't. The evidence points to Richard III. He had custody of the boys. He had a motive. They threatened his crown. He had an opportunity. Some sources later add that a man named Sir James Tyrrell later confessed to smothering the princes on Richard's orders. In 1674, workers found two small skeletons hidden behind a wall in the Tower. They're now buried in Westminster Abbey. Richard III probably ordered their deaths. Margaret attended Richard's coronation in July 1483. She was still negotiating for her son's peaceful return, still hoping Henry could come back as Earl of Richmond, marry a York princess, live quietly as a nobleman. She wasn't plotting to make him king. Not yet. But by September, rumors spread. The princes were dead. And that's when Margaret's strategy changed. She began plotting in secret. Her unlikely ally? Elizabeth Woodville, the former queen, the prince's mother. If Elizabeth thought Margaret killed her sons, she'd never have worked with her. But she did, because she knew who the real murderer was. In medieval England, the murder of a child, especially a royal one, was an unthinkable sin. Margaret realized that Richard III would never forgive her son, and she might never see him again. A tyrant who could kill his own nephews would spare no one who threatened his crown, so she made a simple yet dangerous plan. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was weak at best. His father, Edmund Tudor, was the son of a Welsh knight and the widow of King Henry V, making Henry's royal lineage distant and legally questionable. Furthermore, the Beaufort line, through which Margaret descended, had been declared illegitimate by Parliament under Henry IV, casting further doubt on Henry's right to rule. To legitimize his claim, Margaret orchestrated a strategic alliance with Queen Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the imprisoned princes. She proposed the marriage of her son to Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. In December 1483, Henry swore in Rennes, Brittany, to marry Elizabeth, thereby uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. This union would not only legitimize Henry's claim, but also symbolize the end of the bloody Wars of the Roses. Other conspirators joined, including the Duke of Buckingham, Richard's own supporter. Why Buckingham betrayed Richard remains a mystery. Some think Margaret tricked him, made him believe he'd end up on the throne. Yet through all of it, every move she made was about to change history forever.
The rebellion was set for autumn 1483. It was a disaster. Buckingham rebelled too early. He couldn't raise enough support. Henry Tudor arrived off the coast too late to help. He had to turn back. Buckingham was captured, executed, in Salisbury on November 2nd. Margaret was caught. Richard III could have executed her. He had every right. She'd committed treason, but her marriage to Lord Stanley saved her. Stanley was loyal to Richard. The king couldn't risk alienating him. Instead, Richard stripped Margaret of everything. Her money, her lands, all of it went to Stanley. She was placed under house arrest, confined to Stanley's custody, cut off from her servants, isolated. Short of torture or execution, Richard couldn't have punished her more severely, but he made one critical mistake. He let her live. And Lord Stanley, whether out of love or calculation, allowed her to keep communicating with her son. The game wasn't over. By August 1485, Richard III's hold on the throne was weakening. His wife had died, his only son was gone. He could have remarried and produced heirs, but he hadn't. Henry Tudor had nothing left to lose. He and his mother had risked everything and revealed their intentions. If he didn't act now, he faced exile for the rest of his life, and all of Margaret's sacrifices might have been in vain. It was now or never. On August 7, 1485, Henry Tudor landed off Milford Haven in Wales. He brought a small army. As he marched through Wales and into England, more men joined him. On August 22, 1485, the two armies met at Bosworth Field. Margaret's husband, Lord Stanley, was there. So was his brother, William. For years, Margaret had carefully prepared Stanley's mind, reminding him of the honor and power of being the father of a king. The Stanleys held back at first, waiting to see who would win. Then, at the crucial moment, William Stanley threw his forces behind Henry. The tide turned. Richard III fought bravely. He charged directly at Henry, trying to kill him personally. But Richard was cut down, killed in combat. Lord Stanley picked up the fallen king's crown. He walked across the battlefield, and he placed it on Henry Tudor's head. With that victory, the Tudor era in England began. Margaret Beaufort was now the mother of the king, the most powerful woman in England. Think about what she'd survived. Married at 6, widowed at 12, nearly died giving birth at 13, lost her only child for 14 years, faced execution for treason, lived under house arrest. She'd been a pawn, a piece moved around by powerful men, but she'd learned to play the game herself. She'd learned patience, strategy, survival. She never gave up on her son, and in the end, she won. Henry VII took the throne. He married Elizabeth of York, just as planned. The Wars of the Roses were over. The Tudor dynasty, one of the most famous royal families in history, had begun. Everything she'd fought for had come true. But Margaret's story doesn't end with victory. There's one more chapter, one final tragedy. For 24 years, Margaret stood beside her son. She advised him, protected him, helped him rule. She founded colleges at Cambridge, Christ's College and St. John's College. She supported scholars and printers. She was known for her piety and generosity. She even had a portrait painted, a massive 6-foot-tall work. It was the first large-scale portrait of an Englishwoman ever created. She was called My Lady the King's Mother and signed documents as Margaret R., as if she were a queen herself. In many ways, she truly was. But in April 1509, Henry VII fell ill. The child she'd nearly died giving birth to, the son she'd been separated from for 14 years, the man she'd fought her entire life to protect, slowly faded away. On April 21, 1509, Henry VII died. He was only 52 years old. Margaret's grief was overwhelming. The mother who could never have another child was childless once more, but this time there would be no reunion. No strategy could bring him back. No patience would be rewarded. For the first time in her life, Margaret Beaufort was completely powerless. She arranged his funeral. She was given precedence over all other women. She stood tall, dignified, devastated. Her grandson, 18-year-old Henry VIII, was now king. Margaret helped organize his coronation. She attended the ceremony in June, but after that, she took to bed. She was exhausted, heartbroken. Her body, damaged since that terrible birth at 13, was finally giving out. What was the point anymore? She'd spent 66 years fighting, surviving, scheming, all for him, and now he was gone. According to legend, she became ill after eating a cygnet, a young swan, at dinner. Maybe it was food poisoning. Maybe her body just gave up. On June 29, 1509, Margaret Beaufort died. She was 66 years old, just over 2 months after Henry. The woman who'd cheated death at 13 couldn't survive losing her son at 66. She followed him into death. The fighter who'd survived everything finally surrendered. But not before she'd changed the history. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the same chapel as her son and his wife. Her tomb was sculpted by an Italian artist named Pietro Torrigiano. It shows her lying in prayer, dressed in widow's clothing. Her face was probably modeled from a death mask. The inscription, written by the scholar Erasmus, lists her achievements, the colleges she founded, the scholarships she created, the students she supported. But her greatest legacy was simpler than that. She was the mother of Henry VII, the grandmother of Henry VIII, the woman who ended the Wars of the Roses and started the Tudor dynasty. A dynasty that would rule England for over 100 years. All because one woman refused to give up, even when she was powerless. Margaret Beaufort proved that survival is its own kind of victory, and that a mother's love can change history. If you enjoyed exploring Margaret Beaufort's incredible story, please like this video and share it with other history lovers. Your support helps me keep discovering these amazing stories from history.